Welcome to this very special live recording of the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my very special guest, Rod Liddle. Rod is very popular on this podcast, so popular this is his third or maybe fourth appearance. He's been on a lot. Rod doesn't really need an introduction, but we'll give him a brief one anyway. He is a columnist for the Sunday Times, the Spectator, the Sun. He is a fly in the ointment of the smug middle classes. He is not afraid to speak his mind on a variety of issues, and he is not afraid to stir up controversy where controversy is needed, which is why he's popular around Spite. Rod, welcome to the podcast.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, mate.
Rod, the first thing I want to ask you is whether you have taken the knee over the past couple of weeks, whether you have partaken in this incredibly important ceremony that our footballers have been doing on TV every other night.
Yes, yeah, you'd be surprised at the answer, wouldn't you? It's remarkable. The idea that this taking the knee is something that the footballers, the England footballers, are doing in order to redress racial inequality is an absurdity. We've already seen that Scotland have said that they will take the knee, but only when they play England. So clearly it's nothing to do with race. It's to do with the amour propre and the vanity project and grandstanding and virtue signalling that the FA and Gareth Southgate and probably some of the England team are engaged in. And indeed, at every single game where people have taken the knee, there has been booing. And mainly, in almost every case, the majority have booed. I mean, the idea that people are behind this is an absurdity. And it's become increasingly absurd during the European Championships, where three teams have taken the knee so far. England, Wales, and the perpetually neutral Swiss. No one else has. So is the implication, therefore, that the Ukrainians and the Italians and the Turks and the Croatians are all racist? Is that what we're meant to think? Mm. Are the Scots racist today, because they didn't take the knee yesterday, but redeemed and uplifted to the nirvana of a racially equal heaven on Friday, when they will bow before the England team? It has become ludicrous. And I'm a big football fan, and what I want to do is for the Euros to get on and to cheer my team on, which is just about England. It's always been England, though I have a hankering at the moment for Hungary. And just forget all this rubbish. They shouldn't be doing anything at the start of games. They're footballers. Why are sportsmen being co-opted into this incredibly straitened and authoritarian political correctness which we have? I don't get it, Brendan. And well, I know you've written very cleverly and very rightly on the subject. So I know it's no news to you.
Well, I want to dig down with you what you think is behind the booing, because of course, the first people to boo were your beloved Millwall.
No, they weren't.
Fellow Millwall fans.
No, they weren't. No, they weren't.
Who was
what's behind the booing is an absolute loathing of Black Lives Matter, the movement. Not of racial equality. People aren't booing because they are Nazis or racists. The first booing occurred at a soccer game between Dallas and somebody else. I forget who the other team was, which was in June of 2020. Mm. And these were the first people who'd been allowed into a game, and they booed. And then, of course, the English football season started, and no one was allowed in to watch any games at all. And then at the first weekend that people were allowed in, Millwall played, I think it was Derby County, awful team, awful people really, played Derby County. And indeed, all the Millwall fans booed. But they also booed at Colchester, who were playing that day, and they booed at West Ham in the London Stadium, and they booed at Chelsea. So whenever it's been brought in, people have always booed. And the reason they booed was very simple. And there was a beautifully written post on a Millwall fan site which said, look, we've had black players at Millwall since 1970. Long before the Guardian editorial meetings had any black people in them. Long before then, long before there were any black members of the judiciary or black social workers, or etc. We, in the working class districts of South London, we were first. We have nothing but support for racial equality. We are not racist, but we loathe Black Lives Matter. And it was put very simply, and everyone agrees with that. And I think if you spoke to Gareth Southgate and said, this Black Lives Matter thing, mate, abolish capitalism and the nuclear family, how do you stand with that? He would say, no, of course I don't stand with that. He's tried to distance the kneeling from Black Lives Matter, as has the FA. But you can't do that. It's a bit like me going like that and saying, no, it's not the Nazi salute. It's moved on from there. It's just an expression of love and togetherness for people. It's an absurdity. And it would never have happened, Brendan, mate, as you well know, were it not for COVID. None of it would have happened.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's one of the most striking things, the fact that as soon as fans, during COVID, during lockdown, there was kneeling every single week. Yeah. Nothing happened. There were no fans. It was just silence. As soon as the fans were let back in, they registered their disapproval. And I want to ask you why you think there is this rush to depict the booing as racist. We almost seem to be reaching a situation, as you know, everything these days is racist, but we now seem to be reaching a situation where to be working class in particular is to be racist, which is ironic for exactly the reasons you've outlined, which is that football, a predominantly working class sport, has been racially equal for far longer than most other institutions.
Exactly.
30% of professional players are black. They're worshipped by kids. They're cheered by football fans. England fans booed the taking of the knee the other day and then cheered to the rafters when Raheem Sterling scored. So given that all the evidence points to the fact that Britain is a more tolerant, racially tolerant place than most of the rest of Europe, in fact, why do you think there is this rush to say that any football fan who boos or does anything we disapprove of must be a racist scumbag?
It is, as you've said, a class battle. And in football, it's been a class battle for, I would say, round about 25 years, 1996. And the bourgeoisification of football, sometimes known as the Charltonification of football, after that team in South London, which isn't Millwall, which has a slightly different ethos. You could call it the Dulwich Hamletisation of football as well. They're another team which waves its LGBTQI flags around all the time. It's a war against the working class, and it's a war against the working class from the same liberal elite which waged a war against the working class over Brexit. It is exactly the same. There is no difference whatsoever. They think that working class people are coarse, stupid, uneducated, racist, and they need to be changed. They must be changed. And football's a brilliant example of it. Because, of course, as you say, football was once a working class sport. When the working man could go along on a Saturday afternoon and howl abuse and be with his mates and not act in the straightened way that the middle class expect people to act, the close buttocked way that the middle class expect people to act. It's very funny. About 10 years ago now, there was a game between Millwall and Brighton at Millwall. And a Brighton sociologist, presumably at Sussex, I can't remember if it was Sussex University, took a load of students along to watch apes in their natural environment, more on working class Millwall apes in their natural environment. And it's to study the way they behave, to look at the way these pigs behave. It's remarkable stuff. At the same time, a national newspaper sent along a reporter to a Millwall-Brighton game, a black guy who reported that he was appalled that the Millwall fans were singing "See Kyle, See Kyle" throughout the game. failing to recognise that it was actually the Brighton supporters singing seagulls, seagulls, seagulls. And so we've had to put up with this for countless years, this idiocy, this condescension, the bullying, and so it goes on. So it goes on.
I think that's a very important point. The irony of a lot of this stuff where they are constantly branding working class football fans as racist. The irony is that there's a racial undertone to their hatred of working class football fans. You know, they will often refer to them as knuckle draggers. They will look upon them as this kind of different breed who needs to be studied and analysed, a herd of people doing stupid things. There is this kind of racial drive behind some of that hatred. But I wanted to bring the
hang on a second. And there's also the other side of the coin, which is that they are also racist towards the very black people whom they're supposed to be supporting. They treat them as a kind of client group, sometimes treating them as children who are perpetually victimized and not capable of standing up for themselves, and devoid of hegemony, devoid of purpose, and so on. And I find it incredibly patronizing. And I suspect more and more black people will find all this stuff incredibly patronizing. And just briefly, the most eloquent stuff on Black Lives Matter and the kneeling came from a player, Nottingham Forest player, Lyle Taylor, who used to play for Charlton, very good striker, who's of mixed race, and said, I'm not having anything to do with this. It's corrosive and divisive. We are supporting an appalling organisation, and the Football Association should have thought more about it before they did this.
Absolutely. Okay, just to bring this forward to other issues that relate to the booing of the knee, I wonder if you mentioned Brexit there, and it's the same kind of pushback. You know, the pushback we had against people who voted for Brexit is they were low information, they were thick, stupid Northerners. I loved it at the countdown to our official leaving of the European Union in Parliament Square. Some lady was holding a placard that said, "This stupid Northerner knew what she was voting for," which is my favorite political placard of all time.
Yes,
but it's the same kind of idea, you know, the ignoramuses, the uneducated, the thick, the ignorant. I wonder if one of the things that worries the kind of chattering classes or the woke elites, or however we want to describe them, is that we are living through a bit of a revolt against deference. You know, you have fans booing a literal genuflection to the politics of identity. You have vast numbers of voters rejecting the European Union, which is apparently the most wise institution on earth. You have this pushback across society, and I wonder if do you feel positive about the current moment in terms of the fact that we seem to be living through a pushback against deference, against the idea that we have to kowtow to these people who know better than us?
Up to a point, yes. And I think things have changed a little bit in the last 6 months as well. I think there has been a kind of shift in the way we think about these things. And I think, the obvious thing to say is, I think the public, the vast majority of the general public, aside from maybe, I would put it at about 16 to 20%, these are the people who are actually giving seats to the Labour Party, you know, in Chipping Norton and in Putney and in Islington. So I think there is that. I think there is that 16 to 20% affluent metropolitan percentage of the population who are on board with all this crap. But I don't think that the general public has ever been on board with this crap. Otherwise, you know, I wouldn't have been a member of Blue Labour 10 years ago, or a supporter of Blue Labour 10 years ago, nor the Social Democratic Party now. I think that's always been there. But I think there's a growing realisation, and this is the thing this is the crucial thing, because culture takes so long to change. Our culture now has been moving in one direction for 40 years. But I think it's beginning to turn back, and you can see it turning back by the speed with which various institutions and corporations and government offices are telling Stonewall to get lost. You know, that is one way. I think you saw it as well with the High Court decision on that very brave a transgendered girl who actually said, I was too young to give my consent for this, and the courts agreed. And I think you're seeing it a little bit in the words of Liz Truss and Priti Patel, and when he's in the right frame of mind, even Boris Johnson. I think there is a general, we get this from more and more institutions, but there are so many more institutions to change. Brendan, it's an interesting thing when you look back to the mid-1970s. The BBC was conservative. It was a conservative institution, and all the popular entertainers of the day were conservative. The two Ronnies, the Morecambe and Wise, Jim Davidson, Jimmy Tarbuck, all conservative. And you may remember, or you may not, that massive concert that Margaret Thatcher held, or was held for Margaret Thatcher before an election, I think 83, when it was virtually the entire establishment of light entertainment was there behind the Conservatives. So the BBC and entertainment was conservative. The Church of England was conservative. It was a conservative institution. The judiciary was conservative. The teachers, an interesting point. I remember when I worked as a speechwriter for the Labour Party in the very early 1980s, saying we should do something about the teachers' strike and support them. And my boss saying to me, fuck them, they're all Tories. Which then they were. The teachers tended to vote Tory. So that's been the massive shift, a massive shift over the last 40 years, that all of that lot have become kind of liberal. They're certainly not left-wing, they're liberal. And we're now beginning to see the kickback against that, and one would hope, though I'll be dead before it happens, that over the next couple of decades we might, actually get back to it's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's proper Marxism. This is the way we move in society. The antithesis was this massive movement towards the left from all our institutions in the 80s, 90s, and current century, and the synthesis will be an accommodation by which we don't make homosexuality illegal. We don't still have a colour bar for people who want to get into the Welsh Guards or into a big city institution, but we get rid of most of the shite which has been accompanied the latter stages of this movement over the last 15, 20 years.
So these institutions and organizations which, in your words, have shifted left, I think one of the most striking things about them, one of the most important things, is how much they are willing to denigrate the country, how much they are willing to say Britain is essentially a bit of a hellhole. And I'm just thinking about when the Tony Sewell report came out, and there was this extraordinary reaction because, this report said Britain is not actually full of horrible racist scumbags. It's not such a bad country. You can make a good fist of it, whatever background you come from. And there was this ferocious response from exactly the sections of society that you're talking about. So why do you think they are so wedded to this view of the country as being completely screwed up, a complete mess, full of scumbags, full of racists? What do you think drives that kind of view that they have?
Because their existence depends upon it. Their living depends upon it. You cannot be in the Labour Party as it is at the moment and buy into Tony Sewell's excellent report because it takes away your raison d'etre. And the raison d'etre is no longer looking out for the poorest people in society and trying to ameliorate the appalling gap in income, the appalling differences in wealth between the rich and the poor, between north and south, between east and west to a degree as well. It's no longer about that. It's now about these various identitarian ideas which are frankly, in the grander scheme of things, of no consequence whatsoever when it comes down to when it's matched up against class. Class is the divide. It always has been, and they're all middle class. It's interesting when you look at the BBC and people say it's left wing. It has a left wing bias. It doesn't have a left wing bias when it comes to taxation. It doesn't have a left wing bias when it comes to nationalisation. It is not. These people know what side their bread's buttered on, you know? So they are able to cleave to this sort of liberalism whilst being extremely affluent, white, or almost entirely, southeast and metropolitan, and feel better about themselves because they have these little client groups to fight for, whether they be people who are transgendered or whether it be black people.
I think that point about class is actually really important because it strikes me that so much of the contemporary culture war and identity politics more broadly is really a class war. It's a class war in disguise because what you have are the professional managerial elites looking down their noses at the lifestyles and the beliefs of working class communities in particular, and often doing more than looking down their noses, actually interfering in those communities and reprimanding people and telling them they shouldn't vote this way, they shouldn't parent this way, they shouldn't think this way. So the culture war, I've always thought, is a class war kind of in drag. And on that question, I wanted to ask you about the Labour Party in particular and how it shifted from being interested in working class people to being absolutely contemptuous of working class people. Because people are often surprised to hear that you come from the left, you grew up a Labour person, you're now an SDP person. How do you describe what has happened to the Labour Party, how it made that journey from being founded to represent the working classes to having this complete sneering attitude to working class people today?
It's interesting. I mean, it began, I suppose, with Mandelson, Campbell and Blair, in that they looked at the previous election results, 83, 87, 79, and to a degree 74, where that process was beginning, and saw that what they thought of as being the blue-collar vote could no longer sustain a Labour government. It wasn't enough to get the Labour Party over the line. And that was the explicit plan of Peter Mandelson and Roger Liddle and all those people who were associated with the Blair project, which was they had to reach out to the middle class. And kind of some of it worked. I mean, in some ways, they also reached out to the aspiring working class who no longer considered themselves working class, but who probably these days are now more in that bracket. And so that was the start of it. But it's as ever the case with political and cultural means that it's very, very difficult to stop them once they've started. And the Labour Party therefore drifted further and further and further towards that redoubt of not raising taxes, of not nationalising, indeed of privatising, which Blair did, of shedding the red flag, of shedding every blue-collar element which accompanied the Labour Party. And so what you saw over the following 2.5 decades, from 96 onwards, and I remember talking to Tony Blair in 1996, I had lunch with him, in Islington, of course, Granita, I think, in fact. I asked him about what things were up for grabs. You know, he was trying to change the party. You'll get rid of Clause 4. You've got to get rid of Clause 4. Everything's up for grabs. He could even at that point consider being in favour of capital punishment. He said everything is up for grabs, everything. In other words, the party kind of didn't stand for anything. And then over the following 20 years, because that process had been set in train, working class voters began to desert the Labour Party, and they began to desert the Labour Party at the turn of this century in small numbers, partly horribly in some cases in the Northwest for the BNP, who they felt were looking after their interests better than the Labour Party were. Much more obviously by about 2010 for the United Kingdom Independence Party, for Nigel Farage's UKIP. But all the time they were drifting away, and more and more often in the northern areas, if they're largely to independents. You know, the number of independent councillors in the northeast, particularly, has rocketed. And they're all SDP, mate. I'm telling you, they don't know it yet, but they are fucking SDP. My mate Anthony High, who's the deputy mayor of Middlesbrough, there's not a thing we disagree about. You know, these people are basically old-fashioned Labour who know that there's a class war, who believe that class war needs to be fought, and who don't go along with any of the rubbish, the identitarian rubbish that the Labour Party currently goes on with. But the Labour Party has been pushed into that corner. And I don't think, Brendan, there's anything that poor Keir Starmer, who I think is quite a nice bloke, that there's anything Keir Starmer can do about it. Because, you know, as soon as he dropped to his knee, whenever it was, what was it, about 8 months ago now, that would have lost him 400,000 votes. Like that, you know, like that. He goes to a church, I think a British Caribbean church, and then later finds out that they aren't terribly keen on gay adoptions and stuff. So he castigates the church, writes it off. All the time he is losing votes, all the time. And there's nothing he can do. He can't renege on that, because if he does, then he loses the very seats which are the only seats which his party are winning at the moment, which is in central London, central Manchester, central Cambridge, maybe, Chipping Norton. Chipping fucking Norton. You know? Tolpuddle Martyrs. I mean, you can see that it's hardly to the Finland station, is it? You know?
I think that's absolutely right. You know, my main emotion for Keir Starmer is pity, really. But I think to add to your list of things that he is not doing particularly well, he also came out recently and said that the Labour Party will always support self-identification in relation to gender and sex. And that's the moment in which I thought to myself, he knows he's never going to win and he's completely given up, because why else would you say something which to most people is so preposterous if you weren't just preaching to the choir?
Well, not really preposterous. It was preposterous 5 years ago, but now, because I think of all all these woke issues, all these identitarian issues, are self-contradictory, and you can pull them apart, you know, just by tugging on the thread, and the whole thing falls apart. And the one which is falling apart first is the transgender stuff. Yeah. And I don't think anyone signs. I just don't think anyone signs up to it. The transgender people I know don't sign up to it. You know, no one signs up to that stuff, and it's enraged the feminists. And I feel some pleasure in that, because I think the feminists fucking deserve it, frankly, if I'm honest. Because many of the things which feminists, it's like Suzanne Moore complaining about being, you know, kicked off the where was she working? The Guardian. The Guardian. You know, she tried to have me sacked for writing hateful things. Well, you've written hateful things now and you're sacked. How do you feel, mate? You know, these are the people, some of the feminists are the people who dug the very road upon which the transgender lobby has driven its gaily coloured cart. You know, so I have a limited sympathy for some of the feminists, even though obviously I agree with most feminist aims. But nobody, I don't think, now agrees with the transgender stuff. It's just gone.
Do you have more sympathy with lesbians who seem to be becoming extinct as a result of what's going on over the past few years? You know, and
yeah, they are. We're going to have a kind of reintroduction program like they've done with red kites in the Chilterns. And one day we may see lesbians flying above the hills of southern England looking for carrion. I feel a bit sorry for lesbians. Most of my lesbian friends are the most doughty opponents of the more extreme transgender movement. And they are infuriated by it. And as you rightly say, they're becoming extinct. But they're not the only ones who are becoming extinct. Women are becoming extinct. That's the point.
Yeah.
You know, they are getting rid of women. They're getting rid of women in a biological sense, But they're also getting rid of women, obviously, as we know, in a sporting sense, in that, pretty soon, I may actually transgender and see if I can get in the England ladies football team. It's because they're bloody useless and it shouldn't be too hard. But more and more sporting titles are won by blokes who are competing against women. But they're also being removed, when the Labour Party decides that preference will be given to people from the transgender community for shortlists. It's the women and black people who suffer. Yeah. Women and black people. Everything they do is paradoxical and fucked up. It is, but I mean it genuinely. Everything they do is self-contradictory. There is no sense to it. So they're also making women obsolete.
So you've described very well the way in which Blair, Mandelson and all the rest started to screw things up and drag the Labour Party into this kind of neoliberal direction. But one of the great ironies of recent times is that under Jeremy Corbyn, who was supposed to rescue the Labour Party from its neoliberal phase and turn it back into a party of ordinary people, what actually happened is that it became more out of touch. And one of my favourite statistics is that if you look at the breakdown of the Labour membership under Corbyn, it was even more middle class than it was under Tony Blair. So how do you account for the way in which the Corbynista Labour Party lost working class voters even more thoroughly than the neoliberal Blairite Party did? What do you think was their key failing in that front?
I think the key failing was on the identitarian stuff, but particularly patriotism. I think people, working class people particularly, but people in general, don't want to vote for a party which loathes the country it lives in, despises its history, despises everything it's done. That being said, one slight kind of amendment. I think that the McDonnell stuff, some of the McDonnell stuff in the 2019 manifesto, just from speaking to people in the Northeast where I was out canvassing for the SDP and so on, was very popular. The nationalisation, the taxation, nationalise the grouse moors. I was absolutely bang on with that myself. I think some of the financial stuff really did appeal to working class voters. And what poor Keir's done in attempting to make Labour more electable is ditch the financial stuff and keep the fucking knee bending. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? So he'll lose more.
Yeah. Okay, so sticking with Labour for a moment, we've, broadening it out to politics in general, there's going to be a general election, a by-election in Batley and Spen soon, which I think is going to be incredibly important, not least because if Labour loses, it will be another sign of their general decline. But also, hopefully when.
No, not hopefully. Sorry, Brendan. If your select audience tonight wants to go down the bookies, Labour won't win. They won't come second. They won't come second, Brendan. They will be beaten by George Galloway's Workers' Party.
Yeah.
And they will be beaten easily by George Galloway's Workers' Party. They will come third. George will sweep up I was speaking to a guy up there a couple of days ago, because obviously we're working in the constituency as well. We'll get a few hundred, we've got a good candidate. But I was talking to someone who knows the Muslim community in Batley and Spen very, very well. Every single one is going to be voting for Galloway that he knew of. Every single one. So the independent who took 6,000 votes off the Tories last time isn't standing and is urging people to vote Tory. Galloway's standing. She'll be lucky to save a deposit, Brendan. This is worse than Hartlepool. I read a typically complacent piece by David Bush, who rather airily said, this isn't Hartlepool. Labour has a much, much better chance here. Labour will romp home here. You haven't been out of Westminster, mate. You don't know what you're fucking talking about. You don't have a clue. and they will lose. I guarantee, I would virtually stake my life on it, such that it is.
I think one of the most important issues in Batley and Spen has got to be the Batley grammar school teacher controversy, because this is such an extraordinary state of affairs. And the fact that people aren't talking about it more is even more extraordinary. A school teacher still in hiding, fearing for his life, crushed, according to his own father, because he showed his school kids a picture of Muhammad during a perfectly legitimate religious education class. What do you think is driving that kind of cowardice, where not only do we have his school turning against him, the teaching unions failing to stand by him, but now we have candidates in Batley and Spen who are openly avoiding this central question of whether teachers in that constituency are free to teach their kids what they want to teach them?
There are 16 candidates standing in Batley and Spen, a few fascists, and the usual nutters. Only one party out of that 16 is saying anything about Batley Grammar School and the appalling treatment meted out to the teacher there, and that's the Social Democrats. We are the only ones, and we've made it the main plank of our policy, that this is an election about freedom of speech and what should happen in this country. You know, that we shouldn't have people going into hiding in this country because they're scared of freedom of speech. We are the only ones doing it. The Labour Party candidate is desperately attempting to cozy up to the Muslim community. The Tory candidate wouldn't dare say anything. Local councillor wouldn't dare say anything. So the two main parties, Labour and Tory, there's this massive issue there. Exactly as one of your, I just saw one of the questions come up from one of the viewers saying, you know, we've had this in France. Yes, that's exactly, this is our France moment. You know, here's a case where a teacher is still in hiding, and two other teachers as well, by the way, as well, and been given very little support by their union, and is having no purchase whatsoever in this election, apart from a minor party such as ours. You know, it's shocking. It's shocking, and but it's predictable. You know, they're scared. They're scared of doing it. They're scared of upsetting the wrong people.
On that question, just to add one more point to it, is this is a continuation, of course, of the obsession with Islamophobia. This notion that anyone who criticizes Islam or demeans Muhammad or whatever else they might describe it as is being phobic, is being prejudiced, is punching down. Why do you think that idea, the idea of Islamophobia, has such a grip on certain sections of society, to the extent that they are scared of standing up for a public servant whose only crime was to teach kids about blasphemy in a religious education class?
Because it's part of the same paradoxical universe in which they live, and which somehow they manage to square the circle. So they will be furious about any notion of Islamophobia, but equally furious about any notion of homophobia. And so, of course, you know, they will be enraged if a Ulster Unionist baker refuses to ice someone's cake. But when you're pushed off the roof of a building in Tehran, they couldn't give a fuck. I mean, this is the point. It's an important point, because it gets to the heart of why the middle-class liberal bien pensant left is so authoritarian and so intent upon closing everybody down. It's because their arguments make no sense once you tie them all together. And as I say, as soon as you pull at one strand, it all falls apart. So they cannot bear being gainsaid. Incidentally, on the Batley thing, I was talking to George Galloway the other night. I get on with George very well. We have to park a few things. Well, Israel, for example. We don't talk much about Israel. And he said, Labour's not going to get any votes here. There aren't enough middle-class people from Islington living here. You know, they're, and that's what it is.
Yeah.
They are lost. Those votes, you know, whatever Keir thinks, and I do like him actually, partly for sentimental reasons. I don't know really why. Maybe it's because he's called Keir. He's not going to get those votes back. They are never, ever, ever coming back because they can't be brought back because he would alienate the rest.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'm going to come on to the audience questions very shortly, but it would be remiss of me not to ask you first about the Conservative Party, given that they are running the country at the moment. And I want to ask you what you think. You mentioned earlier on that there are some leaders of the Conservative Party who are pushing back against wokeness to a certain extent, Liz Truss, Priti Patel, and maybe Boris Johnson. But what do you think when you hear Boris Johnson say things like, don't boo the knee, or when he talks about at the G7 about building back in a gender neutral fashion, which is completely meaningless? Do you think that's his wife speaking?
I thought he was taking the piss. I mean, it's the sort of thing I'd have said if I'd been invited. We're going to build back in a gender neutral. I mean, it's utterly meaningless. It's pointless. And I think, at least I'm not a great fan of Boris, but I think he knew it was meaningless, and I think he knew. I think he knew what he was doing. As for the taking the knee stuff, I think he was a bit fucked. I think he had the Football Association on his back and, you know, knew that we all wanted to enjoy the Euros and was just trying to be placatory. I kind of absolve him from that. I don't absolve him from being a dilatory buffoon, but I do absolve him from that a bit. I'd be far happier if Dominic Cummings was still there, because Dominic's not a Tory. You know, he's probably one of us, in as close as you can get. But there's also a clear-eyed vision there and a dislike of wokeness. I think it's difficult. I think there's a bit of a battle going on in the Conservative Party. There are those, such as Priti, such as Liz Truss, such as Kemi Badenoch. Interestingly, the women and the ethnic minorities, you know? Mm-hmm. These are the people who take a very, very strong line on identitarian politics. And one just hopes that in the end they have their way. It would look at the moment, despite the prevalence of Princess Nut Nut in number 10, that they still do kind of have their way, in that the music which is coming out of government at the moment with the Stonewall stuff, and that's going across loads of government departments. Yeah. I've never been more happy since we beat Germany 5-1 than learning that Stonewall was being evicted from every one of its single redoubts within government. So that's quite a big move. And it's also, I think also a few London colleges have booted out Stonewall as well. So I think there is a turn there. I think there's a change there. And if Boris has got any sense, he will see that this is quite a big movement. You know, the votes in Hartlepool, the vote in 2019, and the vote which is coming up in Batley isn't simply about Brexit. Even if Brexit is one of the symptoms of this sort of anti-working class malaise, which both the Tories and Labour and the Liberal Democrats all got themselves into. I think if he plays it right, and he seems to have the right notions in this direction, then we may begin to see a bit of a rollback. I hope.
Before I leap into the questions from viewers, what are your views on Boris's extension of the lockdown restrictions? Because it seems to me that there's an element of cowardice now creeping into government. They're so nervous about contradicting Sage or doing anything that could be held against them by Labour or by The Guardian or by anyone else. And this fear of new variants, as if we are ever going to crush all variants and be COVID-free in the future, which strikes me as a bit of a fantasy. What is going on with this refusal to throw society open to normality?
I think it's a lack of confidence and a lack of intelligence in government, and they feel themselves enthralled to the scientists. such as Susan Mitchell, who says we should wear masks forever and socially distance forever. Well, you know, possibly if I was married to Susan Mitchell, I would agree with her and stay as far away as I possibly could. But at the moment, that's what they're doing. They are following a monomaniacal mindset from scientists, where actually it's a political decision, and it ought to be made a political decision. Now, you know, if you remember, Brendan, I was quite pro-lockdown a year ago. I thought, we don't know what we're dealing with. This seems to be a sensible move. I don't mind it. But I would, to echo Primo Levi, you know, on June 21st, if not now, when? Because there is no when. There will always be a new variant. There will always be a new variant, which is dangerous. As soon as July the 19th has come along, the kids will be going back to school pretty soon after that. You know, we will be it will be Groundhog Day. We will be in the same position next year. We have to make a change. And, you know, I've just been watching Hungary playing football in front of 61,000 people in Budapest, and virtually no one wearing masks. And very sadly, Hungary lost to that thick-necked boar, Cristiano Ronaldo, and all the rest of them. And Pepe. God, I can't stand Portugal. Anyway, that's not the point. That it was so uplifting to hear those supporters, and it changed the nature of the game. It was a much more exciting game as a consequence of the players played differently. We have to get back to something approaching that. And I don't think it's incivistic to say this anymore. Maybe last year you and I would have disagreed about this. I'm afraid to say that by now, my wife told me a year ago we'll be here in a year's time, and she was right. And I think we really need to get ourselves out of it very, very quickly indeed. Because it is bad enough being run by politicians, but for Christ's sake, we never want to be run by doctors, ever. They see one thing and they will never let it go. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, Rod, I'm going to fire some questions at you from the audience. The first one, I'm really keen to hear your views on this. Lindsay asks, what are your first impressions of GB News?
Right. Well, I was on it last night, actually. Yeah. But I was a bit pissed, so I didn't take all of it in. First impressions are, I wish they had chosen someone other than Helen Keller to do the sound and set design. I think that would have been, you know, someone different. The sets don't look terribly good. The sound doesn't sound terribly good. I think it's awkward at the moment, but it's bound to be awkward. It's a brand new television station. I don't know how much money is behind it. I think an awful lot of it is teething problems, which will be overcome in the first, after a month or two. I have to say that, you know, when I first heard Times Radio, I was less than impressed. But over time, it's got better and better and better, other than Hugo Rifkind, obviously. But it's got better. And I suspect that GB News will get better as well. I think one thing Andrew's got to do, what Andrew Neil's got to do, is stop straddling the fence a bit. It's either going to be a centre-right news programme, news channel, a bit like Fox, or it's going to be a neutral news channel in which you hear right-wing voices in a way that you do not on the BBC, but you also hear left-wing voices in a way which actually sometimes on the BBC you don't hear. You don't hear those left-wing voices on the economy. I would prefer the latter, but either way, you can't have both. You know, you've got to choose one or the other.
Okay. Callum wants an update on peak wank. So last time you and I spoke, you said that we were reaching peak wank. There was only so much wank, i.e. absolutely crazy nonsense people could handle. What's your latest view? Have we reached peak wank? Have we passed it?
No, you see, the trouble is, I think I probably ejaculated too soon when answering that question before. I would like to say that, yes, we are a peak wank. I think, sort of these years, from 2019 to about 2024, this is a culture war battleground, and I think that we will win, and I think things are changing. But there will be more madness to come. I hadn't envisaged, when I talked about peak wank, the knee-bending shite. That hadn't occurred to me. But they only got away with that because there was no one around. Never forget that. There was no one around.
We have a question from Dave. Always good to have a question from someone called Dave, who asks, are you being too easy on Keir Starmer? And I actually had a similar thought when you were speaking. I mean, you're right. I'm sure you're right. He's a nice guy. Jeremy Corbyn may have been a nice guy too, possibly. Are you being too soft on him? What drives your view of Starmer as being a generally nice guy, even though he's making colossal mistakes?
I think he seems to be relatively decent when it comes to. I think he was relatively decent over COVID in the early days of it. I think there's a general niceness about him, but I mean, the main reason I'm nice about him is because I think he is well and truly fucked. I genuinely think there is no hope for him. I think there would be more hope in a way if Rebecca Wrong-Daly took over the party and shifted it as far to the left as you could go. And then at least, by about 2028, you could easily see a coalition between Labour, the Green Party, the Lib Dems, the SNP, which could conceivably win an election. Except I still think they're all fighting for the same round about 20-25% of the vote. I feel sorry for Keir Starmer. It's the truth. And maybe that makes me too easy on him. Yeah, sure.
Okay, all right. So this is the final question. I'm actually going to mash together two different questions, and it might give you an opportunity to talk about the SDP or to talk about your political views more broadly at the moment. Karen asks, is there room in the UK for another mainstream political party? And then Teresa asks, Teresa says, a lot of the ideas that we're discussing tonight, there is broad agreement for them in society.
Yeah.
But how can we tie that together? How can we manifest that? How can we make sure that there is a space in society where these kinds of thoughts have expression? And I guess where the 20% that you're talking about don't dominate political life.
Yeah, well, the short answer is proportional representation, because it's virtually impossible for a party like the Social Democratic Party to make a breakthrough, to cut through, at a by-election where there are 16 people standing. No one's heard of the SDP. We've talked to them about our industrial policy and everything. How on earth do you break through? You cannot do it. But at the same time, I don't think there's a future for Lawrence Fox and a party which sort of is all over the place and just says reform or reclaim, or I think all that's gone as well. But I think there is room in the country for a party which represents working class people, which has a sense of tradition and history, which is perhaps conservative on social issues, but left-wing on economic issues. I think that seems to be what the opinion polls say people want. Which is why I'm in the SDP. But until you join, Brendan, and Baroness Fox joins, is it Baroness?
Baroness Fox, yes.
It's Baroness Fox, fucking hell. Until Baroness Fox joins and all of you guys watching, we can build it up from a tiny party. We've increased by about tenfold in the last couple of years, and we're now standing in all elections that come along. We came very close to beating the convicted sex offender in the Hartlepool by-election, which cheered me up no end. But we need help. You need people. You need commitment. More than anything else, we need money. Because I don't see any of the other parties doing that. I don't see. The Conservatives are to a degree in that, if you go up north, they have delivered jobs or they're promising to deliver jobs. And, of course, they are socially conservative sometimes. But, I I wouldn't trust them as far as you could throw them, to be honest. So I think there is room for another party, but it's a long, hard slog to make it work.
Rod Liddle, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thanks, Brendan.